We depend on our airlines to get us where we need to go and safely. The Federal Aviation Administration, known as the FAA, is specifically tasked with safety risk management for air travel. Its mission is to provide the safest and most efficient aerospace system in the world, and that includes specific standards to ensure that flight crews maintain excellent health. Welcome to Freedom Alive. Captain Bob Snow has flown the skies for more than 40 years, a commercial pilot for 31 years, and a captain for 25. Bob has loved every minute of it, but all that changed November 4th, 2021, when the airline ordered Bob to get the COVID shot or be fired immediately. Matt, I think I speak for both of us when I say that I believe that God protects us in miraculous ways from tragedy. And that is definitely the case here after Captain Bob Snow landed his commercial flight in Dallas on April 9th, 2022, with 200 passengers on board. Speak to that.
Yes, it's not only for him, but also for the passengers that were on board. If there were just a few minutes difference in timing when this situation actually occurred in the cockpit, he would have been in the air, or even worse, he would have been on the landing approach, which the landing approach and the takeoff are the most two dangerous aspects of flying in terms of if you lose control. Yeah. Whether you can recover in time. Obviously, if you're 30,000 or more feet in the air and you have a problem, you have a lot of room to be able to maneuver. But if you're close to the ground, either taking off or landing, it's a different story. Just a couple of minutes difference, and there could have been tragedy not only for Bob himself, but also for the passengers on board.
We cannot wait to bring you this story, but our Freedom Alert is next.
The Department of Defense is desperately trying to dismiss the military case. I'm Matt Staver, co-host of Freedom Alive. Liberty Counsel filed a response asking federal judge Stephen Merriday to deny the Department of Defense's motion to dismiss the case of Navy SEAL 1 versus Austin. Liberty Counsel represents many military plaintiffs, and we are seeking class certification for all 6 branches of the military who have been unlawfully denied religious exemptions from the COVID shot mandate. Previous injunctions granted by the court have already determined that the plaintiff's free exercise rights under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act have been violated. This in addition to the irreparable harm of being discharged and having to pay back education and training costs. The Department of Defense is purging our military of those members who love God and love America. We won't stand for it.
Thanks, Matt, for that Freedom Alert. Up next is our interview with Captain Bob Snow.
Well, our very special guest here on Freedom Alive is Captain Bob Snow, a captain of a commercial airline. And welcome to Freedom Alive, Bob.
Thank you for having me.
Captain Snow, you have an incredible amount of experience in flying aircraft. Can you give an overview of your experience? And then I want to bring us up to the time when you began taking the COVID shots in November 2021. Give us some background as to your experience in the airline industry.
Oh, absolutely. My desire to fly goes back to my early childhood. I think when I was 7 years old, I decided I wanted to be a pilot. So I surrounded myself with all sorts of aviation toys and whatnots, and worked my way through Boy Scouts and concentrating on aviation as much as I could. Always fascinated with aircraft. Grew up as a military brat, surrounded by aircraft. So it just seemed like a natural progression for me. I decided early on, as I said, that flying was for me. So as I went to college at Texas A&M University, I concentrated on getting commissioned in the United States Air Force. Was selected for the pilot slot. Received my commission in 1983, went to pilot training, graduated pilot training in 1984, was selected to fly C-130 Hercules aircraft. I did that for another 6 years. Separated from the Air Force in 1990, began flying commercially in late 1990, early 1991. Had been a captain for almost 25 years total time.
So thank you for your many, many years of service. There's such an incredible background that has ultimately brought you to this point in time to be a captain of a commercial airline. Prior to November 2021, what was your health like before you took the COVID shots?
Very healthy. We are required to receive annual physicals as a term of our employment and to maintain our FAA licensing. So essentially, our ability to fly is predicated upon our ability to hold a medical. If you can't hold a medical, then your license is basically you can't exercise it. So I received a medical twice a year from the FAA, and one time during each one of those would be an EKG. So to backtrack a bit, give you a little background on the vaccine requirement from the company. The company in early October, mandated that everyone was going to be required to receive the vaccine. Prior to that they had basically indicated that they desired we would get it, but there was no mandate at that point in the game. So they basically told us as of first part of October that it was jab or job. You were going to receive the vaccine or you were going to be terminated. And that was unambivalent. There was no questions as to their intent. They were going to have everyone basically vaccinated or terminated. And I was very hesitant when I heard that, because and I don't like to use the term hesitant, because that tends to be associated with vaccine hesitancy. I'm not vaccine hesitant. I was immunized for many, many things over the years. I get my flu shot every year. During my time in the Air Force and during my time traveling internationally, I was required to receive immunizations for various diseases and ailments as a term of travel. And I understand that. I consider myself well versed. But this was something different for me. These vaccines, so-called vaccines that were issued under an EUA, I found a little bit suspect, and alarms were going off. I was very reticent, not wanting to receive the vaccine. But I'm the sole provider for my family. My wife doesn't work. I still have 2 kids in the house. I've got a college student and one who's going to graduate high school next year. So it was basically a financial decision. At the time, the word was that we could apply for religious exemptions as necessary, or medical exemptions. Well, I certainly don't have a medical exemption requirement. I've never had a problem with vaccines in the past. But and I felt it was basically, if I requested a religious exemption, that would be under a false pretense. My concerns were more medical, ethical, and moral when it came to the actual receipt of the vaccine. So many people out there are jumping up and down and screaming, "My body, my choice." Well, I think that this same thing basically applies. I'd already had COVID. I actually got COVID in March of 2021, and was basically rode it through. It really wasn't too bad. I lost my taste and smell. I had a very low-grade fever, a lot of fatigue. I came out the backside fine. No issues whatsoever with any sort of cardiac issues, that's for sure. No issues with the lungs, and no long-term effects. So I'd already had 2 physicals, in fact, prior to my event on April 9th. So, to answer your question, ultimately, I was healthy.
You had an incident. Let's take us up to April 9 now, 2022. Describe what happened on that day, and take us through that event of April 9, 2022.
Well, in the morning of April 9th, we started our day in Denver. We were going to conduct a flight from Denver to DFW. On our arrival at DFW, we were then to do a turn to Salt Lake City and then finish our trip. That was day 4 of a 4-day trip. Awoke in Denver at the hotel, went downstairs, had a light breakfast, went to a DIA. All preparation was normal. No health incidents, no precursors, no warning, no nothing. Conducted the flight from Denver to DFW. We landed the aircraft. We're very fortunate to get the runway of our choice, basically on the same side of the airport as our gate. So it allows us to be a little more expeditious. So we turned off the runway, taxied straight to the gate. Arrival at the gate, we shut the aircraft down. We have a checklist and procedure that we utilize for shutting the aircraft down to prepare the aircraft for the next crew to come on board. The FO excused himself to go to the lavatory. Normally, that's not unusual at the termination of a flight because of our being at our flight stations during the course. So as he was in the lavatory, which is immediately behind the flight deck, I got up to collect my bags, was preparing to depart the aircraft to go to the next aircraft, and that's the last I remember. That's the point that I basically suffered a sudden cardiac arrest and collapsed in the flight deck. And so that's the last memory I have prior to waking up in the ICU at the hospital in the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
So when you collapsed, were the other people already off the aircraft, or were they disembarking at that time? You don't know.
Actually, we were still deplaning. We had a full plane coming out of Denver, so we still had passengers coming off the airplane. Now, apparently, one of the passengers, or some of the passengers, witnessed me in a heap in the flight deck, if you will, and asked if everything was okay. At that point, of course, the alarm bells went off, and the flight attendant immediately came to check on me. The FO emerged from the lavatory, and he's a very highly experienced Air Force pilot, had done several tours in the Middle East, quite familiar with traumatic situations. They jumped into action. Very serendipitously, if you will, we had a RN and a Navy corpsman who were deplaning the aircraft, who rendered immediate assistance. I believe they started CPR. At that point, checked for a pulse, of course, no pulse. So even more impressive and miraculous, if you will, is that the crash fire rescue people, the fire department and the ambulance that is attached to DFW was at the very next gate or very close by. So when they received the call, they didn't have to dispatch from the fire station. They were basically just ran across the ramp and ran up the stairs. So my understanding is that CPR was administered, and I can certainly still feel the after effects of that. Anytime I sneeze or cough, I still have a very sore sternum. It's not unusual that people get injured during CPR, just in case the CPR has been effective. And I was administered 3 shocks from the AED to restore my normal heartbeat and sinus rhythm. So 3 shocks from the device plus CPR, and I was rushed to the hospital.
Wow, that's astounding. Let me back up before we continue your story. What happens? This was about 6 months after you landed, as I understand it. You were on the ground, you were deplaning, you had been on the ground for about 6 minutes or so. Let's wind the clock back about 7 minutes, and you're on the approach to the landing strip. And say what would happen at that time if this incident had happened, say, 7 minutes before, when you're still on the aircraft seeking to land the aircraft.
If you think of the final approach portion of any aircraft as basically being a point in a cone, and that cone comes to a fine point, that fine point being the touchdown of the aircraft and then a rollout down the runway. As you get closer to the runway, time becomes more compressed and things become more critical due to your proximity to the ground. Things happen a little bit faster. So certainly any sort of interruption to a normal flight procedure at that point, a pilot incapacitation closer to the ground becomes more and more critical. And there's 2 of us up there for a reason, but by the same token, your response time is significantly reduced in the event that you're on final approach phase and approaching touchdown. So I prefer not to consider exactly what the direct outcome would have been had this happened anytime inside of what we consider 1,000 feet, which is where things get really critical, 1,000 feet above the ground. But the timing was for me, I just leave it at the fact that for what happened to me in regard to the passengers and in regard to my final health outcome it was very good timing that it happened where it did. Had it happened earlier, I would have been further away from treatment. The passengers would have been certainly placed in great risk as a result of me becoming incapacitated during any portion of the flight, and especially during the final approach and landing portion.
So you were taken to the hospital, and tell us what happened when you got there and what was your diagnosis. What do you attribute this to?
Taken to the hospital where the initial clinical diagnosis was sudden cardiac arrest. And fortunately, my heartbeat had been restored to basically a normal heartbeat by the time I arrived. All indications were that, by blood tests and medical testing that's accomplished, was that I had suffered basically a heart stoppage. As
a side note, we have interviewed on our radio program in that radio program, we interviewed EMS workers that are actually work at the Denver airport and in the Denver area. And one of the things they said to us is after the COVID shots began, one of the things that they clearly had across the board of all the EMS workers and those within the fire department are more coded calls to the airport, people that were coding on the aircraft or coding in the terminal. And they attributed to these COVID shots that there was an increase in spike of cardiac events and even coding where your heart completely stops, and they had to render not only CPR but do the shocks as well. In your situation, how long were you in the hospital, and what do you attribute this to? Is this as a result of the Johnson & Johnson shot? Obviously, you were healthy before. We know that there are certain consequences to these COVID shots now. Unfortunately, you may have been one of those.
Well, I was admitted to the hospital on April 9th, about 10 o'clock in the morning, give or take. Was discharged on April 15th. So I spent basically 3 days in critical ICU, and then what they call, I guess, intermediate ICU afterwards, another 3 days prior to discharge. So, you're talking about, issues that, can we directly attribute it to the Johnson & Johnson shot? If you're attempting to draw a direct correlation, it's going to be very difficult to do that. As we all know, the medical community, it's almost a third rail for the medical community. Very few people are willing to come forward and speak out on the possible effects of these vaccines. So, but for me, the timing is very suspicious. That everything for me is fine up until the point I received the vaccine. After I received the vaccine, my arm was sore for about 10 days, which is unusual for me. Normally, I get a vaccine, and it's typically 1 or 2 days, I think, which is average for most people. But this was 10 days. If I rolled over my arm while I was sleeping, it would wake me up. It was that sore. So I really, after that pain resolved itself, I really had no more indications of a problem until beginning in early January, where I started noticing some strange pains, particularly once during a flight was the first time I noticed it. We were on the ground in Orlando. We were going to fly from Orlando to Washington, D.C., and I was doing some work on the overhead panel, and as I reached up and noticed that kind of something tweaked in my shoulder, and that pain kind of spread down through the lower right quadrant and then back up through my chest, and it kind of resolved itself after about 1 or 2 minutes. I thought it was kind of unusual. I'd never experienced anything like that before, but it cleared itself up. Now, at the termination of that trip, oddly enough, I basically was diagnosed with COVID again, a second time, which at this time I believe was Omicron, because it basically manifested itself as sniffles and sneezing. It was cedar season here in Central Texas, where I live, and I do have a reaction to cedar, as do many people here. FO also lives in the general area. He has reactions to cedar, so we were both sniffling and kind of sneezing. I had about 4 days off, so when I got home, I thought, I better go get tested for Omicron. When I looked at the symptoms, went and got tested, came back positive, called the FO, he went and got tested, came back positive. Very, very minor symptoms. Honestly, you'd think you just had a small, slight cold. But went back to work after that and started getting more and more of these instances of these odd pains. So I actually called my gastroenterologist because I'd had some gastroenterology issues over the last few years, minor. And he said, well, let's come in. We might want to take a look for a hiatal hernia or possibly some gallbladder issues. So I went in and got basically a full endoscopy, came back normal. I actually had a abdominal and chest CAT scan. We were waiting for the clinical interpretation from the radiologist for the CAT scan when I collapsed in the flight deck. So those results haven't been published yet. So, it's not like I was ignoring any sort of symptoms. We were trying to run them down, having not had any history of any sort of cardiac issues whatsoever. I naturally just looked at what my health history was, which was basically gastroenterology, and that's where we went. Last thing I ever thought was to pick up the phone and call the cardiologist.
Because you already had normal EKGs for many years, for a decade.
Yes,
so now, after we saw a video where you actually did a video that you posted, and it was in the hospital with all of the wires attached to you.
My name is Bob Snow. I'm been a captain for a number of years. My total service with the company is over 31 years. On November 7th, I was mandated to receive a vaccine. Quite literally, I was told if I did not receive the vaccination, I would be fired. This was from our director of flight. So, under duress, I received the vaccine. Now, just a few days ago, after landing in Dallas, 6 minutes after we landed, I passed out. I coded. I required 3 shocks. I need to be intubated. I'm now in the ICU in Dallas. This is what the vaccine has done for me. I will probably never fly again, based upon the criteria that the FAA establishes for pilots. I was hoping to teach my daughter to fly. She wants to be a pilot. That will probably never happen. All courtesy of the vaccine. This is unacceptable, and I am one of the victims. You can see that this is the actual result of the vaccine for some of us. Mandatory, no questions asked, get the shot or you're fired. This is not the American way.
Since that video has come out, and since your story has been known around the world, have other pilots, have other airline staff contacted you about situations that they're experiencing?
Absolutely. Yeah, I've received numerous phone calls from people that have concerns. Up to very recently, people have expressed, their concern over clinical issues they may be having. There has been a history of airline pilots that have become either debilitated, some have passed away, and others have come down with myocarditis. It's there, it's real, it's happening. It's not just pilots, it's flight attendants, it's broad spectrum across the board. Now, for pilots in particular, most pilots are very hesitant to want to come forward with this because it could be career ending. For me, it definitely was. It was almost life ending for me. So I encourage anyone who thinks that they're having issues, regardless your walk of life or your age or your profession, get tested. If you think you're having issues, certainly go and tell somebody that you have concerns, myocarditis, pericarditis,
Captain Snow, in the video that you did, you said this is un-American, and I certainly agree with you. The kind of pressure that is being put on people to get these COVID shots against their will, whether it's religious-based or any other reason, no one should be forced to get these shots. In your final moments here, talk to the viewers about what you want them to know. What's the takeaway, and what's the message that you want others to hear?
Well, we received a full court press globally from governments and from the CDC, the World Health Organization, basically stating this was all safe and effective. And I'm here to tell you that it's not safe and it's not effective. We know it's not effective. Many, many people out there have gotten COVID after being fully vaccinated, fully boosted. And for the vast majority of us, unless you have some significant comorbidities, COVID is survivable. It's not that big of an event. Now, if you have comorbidities, obviously I understand that's a game changer. But for most of us, this one size fits all solution of get vaccinated or else, is unacceptable to me. It's not a vaccine. It's an experimental cocktail. And we are now basically members of the largest clinical trial in human history, as far as I'm concerned. And I'm one of the people that have, as far as, again, I'm concerned, have suffered damage because of this. It's cost me my career. I had 5 years to go until mandatory retirement at age 65. And I would have retired as a wide body captain for a major airline in the United States, a significant loss of income for me and a significant loss of lifestyle. I still, again, have kids at home. I have a wife that doesn't work. So for them to put me in this both financial, professional, and personal situation is, to me, as I said, un-American. This is supposed to be a place where we have opportunity and we have freedom. But the ability for someone to come and tell me that I have to receive an experimental cocktail that may or may not cost me my career or my life, I find that intolerable. It's an unacceptable situation. So for anyone out there that is still debating whether or not they should receive the vaccine, I think you should do some serious introspection as to whether it's right for you. Because you go back and look at the swine flu vaccine that basically released in the 1970s. I remember that. I was in high school. There was discussion at the time, it was also sold as safe and effective. Well, until they figured out that it was neither. And that was yanked rather quickly. This vaccine, I want to call it that, was not yanked, and it's still out there. being disseminated and injected into people, and people need to be aware of the fact that this is it's dangerous.
Well, Captain Snow, thank you for your service. Thank you for sharing your story, and thank you for getting out this message and joining us on Freedom Alive today.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate you giving me the chance to tell my story.
Thank you.
Matt, what a remarkable story, and what a tragedy, really. I mean, on a personal level, I mean, a person 40 years, captain for 25, top of his game, completely normal. And then again, an example of these shot mandates and how it plays out.
Steve, it's really un-American that any employer, any military would force an individual against his or her will to get these COVID shots or any other shots, but particularly these experimental COVID shots. And it is un-American also to continue to hide the reality that for a number of people, many people, these shots are not safe, they're not effective, they have ultimately taken the lives of individuals. In Bob Snow's case, he nearly died. His heart stopped, and he had to be brought back by CPR and by the paddles to shock his heart back into operation. But his career is gone. He'll have to now wear this mechanism to monitor his heart. But there's so many other tragedies that have happened.
Exactly.
And our government continues to suppress that information. It's out there. If you do research, unfortunately in his case, he did the research after. We did the research before, and that's why we've made our own individual decisions with regards to these COVID shots. But so many people do the research after, and then they realize, oh my goodness, I'm one of those statistics now. I wish I would have known. Our government should tell us. They should not lie to us. They should not repress the truth. And we should not force this on anyone.
I'm just reminded in God's word in Psalm 91, verses 9 and 10. It says, if you say, the Lord is my refuge, and you make the Most High your dwelling, no harm will overtake you, no disaster will come near your tent. We love bringing you this information. We love bringing you these examples. And we want you and your family to be armed with the best information to make the best decisions for your family. Well, that's it for today, but be sure to tune in next week, where we'll update you on existing battles and alert you to new government overreaches. We'll tell you about the victories people of faith are winning and how you can fight back and stand up for your priceless freedom. Join us again for Freedom Alive.